So I was inspired by Nick's work on geography to push a little bit harder on our long-term project on immigrant success in the US, to try to understand where are the streets of gold? What is the role of the residential location choices that immigrants make, the region they move to, whether they're moving to an urban or rural area, and then within cities, the neighborhoods that they choose. And I even went out further on the limb to push beyond really my comfort level, outside of the United States and outside of economic history, to compare immigrants moving to the US and a whole set of European destinations today. So I'm going to end the talk with that. So I'm trying to be brave here. And this is what inspires the picture that's on the front slide, which is, does anyone recognize it? It's a bit faint, but it's the new statue that was installed in the Vatican in 2019 called Angels Unaware. And it's a representation of a series of migrants through history, both migrants to the United States from Europe, as well as migrants from the rest of the world to Europe today. So perhaps you recognize in the title, Streets of Gold. This was the name of my book 2 years ago with my longtime collaborator, Ron Abernitsky. And we have on the front cover a very optimistic image of a rainbow of migrants moving to opportunity in the United States. And so the question is that same opportunity present in all locations? And what is the role of location in determining that opportunity? And is it also present here in Europe today for migrants that are coming to a very different location? So what I'm going to talk about are 3 different levels of geography. The first part is work that you may have already seen. So I will just sort of set the stage with some older work here, where we show that in the past, in the United States, immigrants to the US settled in highly mobile regions. They avoided the US South and moved to the North and West. And within the North and West, they moved to cities more than to rural areas. So geography played a very central role in their upward mobility. So this finding is not new, but I'll bring everyone up to speed with this. But then I want to zoom in to very local geography and think about immigrant neighborhoods and enclaves, as well as zoom out to think about destination country. One choice is the US versus other options in the New World, and today we have the New World countries as well as a set of previously migrant sending regions who are now newly migrant receiving areas. And here I was really inspired by Nick's work. One thread running through his research agenda has been the role of geography in determining economic opportunity and productivity. And he pursued this agenda at different levels of geography. The first paper at the top is a cross-country study of where did industrialization take off first under a certain set of transportation and trade regimes, and then where did industrialization diffuse to in later periods. That's a country-level story. The second paper at the bottom of the slide is a within-country analysis of where within Britain did industrialization first take off, and what were the roles of both resources, so sort of the first nature that Steve mentioned earlier today, as well as agglomeration effects. So this sort of fractal design where you're going from the country level to the region level and then even down to the neighborhood was sort of my inspiration for putting this set of work together. So I'm going to to start with that first finding that I mentioned, which is how important geography at the regional level has been for upward mobility of immigrants in the United States. First, what do we mean by upward mobility? So we're going to be talking about this throughout the talk, so I just want to set the stage. On this slide here, there's two different time periods represented. One is a historical period for children who were living at home in 1910 and were in the labor market in 1940. The second one is children who were living at home in 1980 and are in the labor market in the 2010s. But other than that, the graphs are set up in a similar way, where on the x-axis we have father's income in income ranks in the national income distribution, and on the y-axis we have son's rank in the national income distribution when the son gets to the labor market. And of course we have this upward sloping relationship. If you're raised in a higher income household, you yourself have higher income in the next generation. But the question is about the two different upward sloping lines we have here. The blue line are the children of US-born fathers, and the orange line are the children of immigrant fathers. And we can see that the orange line is always above the blue line in the past. So at any point in the income distribution, we see that the children of immigrants have a 5 or 6 rank point advantage. And that's what I'm going to talk about as upward mobility. So children of immigrants have an advantage relative to children of local born in their own economic attainment, conditional on growing up in the same resourced household. That's true in the past, and it's also true today. And that is what really blew our minds in the first round of work. We were not expecting this. The American story is built on the idea of the first picture, the idea that 100 years ago, the children of immigrants could move up. But there's a lot of concern that that's not true today. And that concern is true on the right and it's true on the left, but for different reasons. You know, on the right, people say, well, the mix of sending country is different, and these are kids who will just never be able to make it. And on the left, there's concern that immigrants face discrimination, and that will be passed on to their kids. But I want to talk about geography here. So let's move on to think about the different causes of this upward mobility. Why is it that the children of immigrants experience more upward mobility? We'll be able to tell you a lot more about the picture on the right soon, but all I have for the modern data so far are these aggregated patterns. I don't have micro data for today. Now, that data that we were able to use from courtesy of Opportunity Insights is available in census research data centers, and we're now using microdata. But what I can tell you about is the picture on the left. And so it turns out that geography at the level of region and at the level of urban-rural is incredibly important in this story in the past. So all the way on the left-hand side here, the tallest bar, that represents the completely raw, uncontrolled rank point gap for kids of immigrants versus kids of US-born at the 25th percentile of the income distribution. But I could have selected any of them because, you know, this line is pretty parallel, right? So we happen to be looking at the 25th here, and that's the 6 rank point gap in the raw data. Now just add some controls. And I've never added controls to try to mediate a relationship and found such a striking effect. Usually it's like, oh, this explains, 10% of what's going on. Well, if you add an indicator for does the family live in the South, that's half the story. And you get all the way to the end of the picture and you're comparing kids raised in the same county, that's the rest of the story. However, you don't have to go all the way to county. Simply by adding an urban dummy, this would do the rest. So So what's going on in the past is that immigrant families moved to areas that were high upward mobility areas for everyone. Their next door neighbors had similar mobility trends. It's just that immigrants were concentrated in those high mobility places. Which areas were high mobility in the past? Well, we can take a look from this graph here, this map on the left. This is work by Dylan Connor and Michael Storper. Dylan is a former grad student of mine from UCLA, and you'll see that he's a co-author on some of the other work that I'll talk about. You may recognize this kind of picture from the famous Raj Chetty New York Times map that really went around the world. And this is the historical equivalent. So what Dylan and Michael did was they linked kids at home in 1920 to their outcomes in 1940. And they looked at upward mobility, not comparing immigrants and natives, but just of all kids. And what they found is that upward mobility was very low in the South. That's still true today. And it was low in the upper Midwest. The darker the blue shade, the lower the upward mobility. And now, here's a picture from our work on the right, where we see where are immigrants located? Where are the children of immigrants growing up? And the lighter the shading, the fewer children of immigrants, the lower the share of the population made up of children of immigrants. So take a look at the South. There's essentially no immigrants there. And that's a large part of the reason why children of immigrants look so successful in the past. There are children of immigrants in the upper Midwest, and so these folks are primarily Norwegian, some Swedish, and if you look at our country-by-country patterns, it's the Norwegian sons that are the ones that are not moving up. So they are the counterexample to the story that we just saw. And why? Well, their geography was not optimal for upward mobility. But otherwise, we see high immigrant shares in New England, through the Rust Belt, in the Pacific, and those are places of high upward mobility in the past. Okay, so that would be the regional and the urban story. But what I want to do next is zoom in on neighborhood. So modern evidence on immigrant enclaves suggests that living in an enclave improves employment and earnings. These are papers that are based on what you might think of as gold standard identification. Refugee assignment policies in place, first paper for Sweden, a second paper, which I'm not citing here, for Denmark, and then a third paper that I am citing for Switzerland. And all three of those papers replicated the original finding. Living around other people from the home country seems to be good for you. Of course, people who need the most help are the ones that move to enclaves in the first place. So it might look like people who live in enclaves are not doing very well, but actually, once you address that selection through these refugee assignment programs, living in an enclave is helpful. So we wanted to know, is this true in the past? These studies are based on very small enclaves, where the typical enclave size is around 100 or 200 people from the home country. The enclaves that we're going to be talking about are enclaves that are on the order of tens of thousands of people from the home country living in neighborhoods next to each other. Might it be that the enclaves of the past do not have the same sort of salutary effect? So just to give you a sense of typical residential patterns, one way of looking at living in an enclave is a measure called the isolation index, which basically means take the average immigrant and measure the share foreign-born in their neighborhood. In the past, this was up to around 8%. When you look at 1910, high point of migration from Europe, it falls as immigration in the country falls, and rises again as immigration rises. So we have just as much isolation for immigrants today as we did in the past. Enclaving is important now, and it was important then. But this 8% is averaging in a lot of very small numbers, a lot of zeros, a lot of 1% for people living in rural areas. And so we see that there are a number of cities that have very large enclaves. The highest isolation index in the past, primarily in the mid-Atlantic, with numbers like 40% of your neighborhood being foreign-born, and very much on par with the high numbers in places like Miami and Los Angeles today. So I'm going to show you a couple of results from two papers of mine, one with Dylan and Ron, and then a second, newer one with Ron and Osea Giantella. And these are two different ways of trying to look at the effect of enclaves in the past. And what we'll see after we get through paper 1 and paper 2 is that we find very consistent results that living in an enclave harmed income in the first generation and upward mobility in the second generation in the past. Living in an enclave isolated immigrants from mainstream labor markets, from learning English, and it had negative effects on their earnings in the end. So it's a cautionary tale to not rely too much on results from modern studies that may have excellent identification, but don't have good external validity to other contexts, both actually other modern contexts as well as, in this case, historical contexts. Okay, so the first paper is based on a mobility program. How do you change someone's enclave status? One possibility is you move people from an enclave neighborhood to an integrated neighborhood, and that's what I'm going to show you in this paper. Another possibility is you keep everyone in place and you drop ethnic amenities on the location, and thereby the enclave grows, and that's what I'll show you in the second paper. Okay, so this was a large mobility program that we're going to look at, but it was not randomly assigned. It was not a government program. It was actually a self-help program within an immigrant community concerned about the potentially negative effects of living in a large enclave. And it was called the Industrial Removal Office, which sounds better and maybe less Orwellian in the native Yiddish. This was a program targeted at Jews who were living in enclaves in New York City in 1910s. There were around 1 million Jews living there at the time, and 3/4 of them lived in an enclave as we've defined. This program provided train fare and short-term lodging if you would voluntarily put yourself forward to leave New York City and move to Denver or Cleveland or Houston or some other part of the country. And a modern historian who has looked at this program as well says the reason for it was that there was concern that the new immigrants endured filth, poor sanitation, disease, and soaring rates of delinquency and crime, and dispersing immigrants would alleviate some of these problems. So very much along the lines of what we think of as the modern Moving to Opportunity program today. The participants in this program were drawn from the 4 Jewish enclaves that are on this map here. Probably most familiar with the Lower East Side, but there were also enclaves in northern Manhattan and in Brooklyn. And this map is based on work that we've done to try to identify who in the census is Jewish based on a Jewish names index, because we don't have religion data in the U.S. Census. We then went to the American Jewish Historical Society archive and found records of 40,000 households who participated in the program. Among these records, we have the exact address of the individuals so that we can pair them with what we might think of as next-door neighbors. And that's going to be our research design, is someone who participated in the program and someone living quote-unquote next door. So, on the same census manuscript page, who did not participate in the program. So our comparison group here, as I mentioned, so So we have male household heads who are likely Jewish, who are foreign-born, who are of the age of a typical mover, so someone who's prime age, and who lives in one of these Jewish enclaves. In 1910, before the program begins, we see that the participants and the comparison group are living in neighborhoods that have a similar Jewish share. Similar share manufacturing, and the participants were living in neighborhoods that were somewhat lower on socioeconomic status. So they had less English speaking in their neighborhood and less white collar status. By 1920, after the program took place, participants were in neighborhoods that were substantially less Jewish, 7% less Jewish, and also better on some of these socioeconomic dimensions. I guess it was a pity, maybe not for them, but for us, that many of these participants did not actually stay in the city to which they were assigned. We were hoping that we could actually get variation of, this guy went to Cleveland and this guy went to Denver, but oftentimes they reshuffled later on. But what we do see is that participation in the program does change your enclave status. We also see that participants were negatively selected relative to the full comparison group. They had 20% lower income scores. Once we control for occupation, which is the primary basis of income score, we see that they're 2% lower income score. By 1920, after they participated in the program, their income is 4% higher. And for their sons in the next generation, we see that their sons' income is 6% higher, though this is not a statistically significant relationship. We do have a pretty small sample here of around 9,000 people. There's other concerns about, who volunteers to participate in a program like this. Maybe they were positively selected on unobservables, and they had a lot more get up and go and gumption. So we do compare men who entered the program earlier versus later, and so had more time to be exposed to a non-enclaved area. Okay, so let's keep these numbers in mind as I then show you the next study, which is that the Jewish share fell by 7%, and income went up by 4 to 6% in Generation 1 and Generation 2. Okay. But now I'm going to turn to a very different setting. It's rare to have a mobility program in the past. It's more common that a neighborhood exists and then a set of ethnic enclaves emerge. Oftentimes those amenities, though, what did I say? Did I say enclave? What I meant was ethnic amenities. So ethnic amenities emerge, like a grocery store, a bakery, a church, a synagogue, a community center. Most of those amenities are endogenous. The neighborhood is growing, there's a larger Italian share there, so there's an Italian bakery that opens up. But what we're going to be focusing on is the centralized decision of Catholic dioceses to place ethnic churches in particular locations. In the United States, there was dispensation to open ethnic churches, not only territorial churches. There was a layer of territorial churches already in place by the time of the second wave of mass migration from Europe. Those territorial churches were almost entirely controlled by the Irish. So they were geographically designated. If you lived in that neighborhood, you were to attend that parish. However, if you belonged to an ethnic community, you had allowance to go to the ethnic church. So here's a map, for example, of Chicago. And this study is going to have 4 different cities where you can see, if you can, I know it might be a bit small, a set of these circles. In 1900, the circles are the territorial churches already in place. And the other shapes that are in different colors, the blue squares, the red triangles, etc., are ethnic churches in place in 1900. By 1930, we have much more coverage of ethnic churches. The red triangles are the Polish churches, and that's what I'll be talking about in the next couple of slides. So what we do here is a neighborhood that receives a Polish church will be our treated neighborhood. And we have a before and an after. Before the church is built and after it's constructed. We also have a set of control neighborhoods that we select with propensity score matching. And we assign each treated neighborhood to one control, so that we say, imagine that something had opened in 1915. Well, it didn't actually. And then we'll compare treated to control. So for those of you who have been around Chicago, it's hard to miss these Polish churches. Here are a few examples. And the way that we think of our research design is sort of along the lines of what John McGreevy, who's a Catholic historian and now provost at Notre Dame, says about this period. He says Catholic neighborhoods were created, not found. The Catholic parish itself helped define what the neighborhood would mean. So it's not that the neighborhood was already endogenously Polish Catholic neighborhood. There were already some families in place, but by designating that neighborhood as a place where the parish would be built, that is the way in which this neighborhood developed its Catholic character. The data that we're going to use comes from the official Catholic directory, which is basically like a phone book of all the churches with their addresses. And you can see from right next to the church's name, in parentheses, its ethnic designation if it has one. We've mapped Chicago, but also Boston, New York, and Philly. Together, these four cities represent around 60% of the new Catholic immigrant groups that we're going to look at. We focus in the paper on Polish and Italian, but I'll just show you Polish today. We then geocode the churches and link them up to census geography. We can look at the residents of the neighborhoods at each point in time, and we also, with linked data, can look at residents who were already there before the church was built. So that's going to address some of the selection, and of course there's a lot of compositional change when a church is built. So what we find is that designating an area as one with a Polish Catholic church affects cultural outcomes and economic outcomes. So on the cultural dimension, for example, we see that at baseline, treatment and control neighborhoods look similar on the share of Polish Catholics who marry other Polish Catholics. But after the church is built, the share marrying another Polish Catholic goes up substantially in the areas that get the Polish Catholic Church. So that's one indicator of cultural connection and density of ties within the community. This might be something that residents highly value. But there's a trade-off there, because on the flip side, when we look at occupation-based income, we see no difference before the church is built. After it opens, we see that income is 7% lower in areas that receive a church. We've also looked forward to the next generation as well, and I know this was a talk about upward mobility, but I'm not bringing that today just for interest of time. And we see that there is persistence and translation forward to the next generation. We think that the mechanism here is likely the growth of the enclave. So if we're looking at the population shares of different group categories, we see that the share of the population that's Polish Catholic is balanced to begin with and then goes up by around 10 percentage points after the church is built. The share Polish, likely Jewish, does not change. And we can look at other groups as well. If share Polish Catholic is going up, share something else has to be going down. It's not other Catholic groups. Share Irish, share German is not changing. There's a little bit maybe decline share Italian, but primarily the decline is coming from groups that we would think of as probably Protestant. So US born and immigrants from predominantly Protestant countries. So putting these two studies together, we see that in the case of the IRO mobility program, those who participated saw the Jewish share of their neighborhood fall by 7 percentage points, and their income rose by 4% in the first generation. in the case of the church study, we see the share of Polish Catholic is up by 10 percentage points and the income falls by 7%. So these are incredibly similar effect sizes where a 10 percentage point increase in your own group share leads to a 6 to 7% decline in income.
So the decline in occupation income score, is that driven by new arrivals, or is it also people who live there?
Also people who live there.
So for example, so if you look at people who were young enough to still adjust what they get, which occupation they choose, versus people who are too old for that, then you should basically, so that would be another counterfactual, right?
That's nice, yeah.
So, and then, if then because then you can disentangle how much is due to people choosing a different occupation, a lower ranked occupation after the church is built versus.
Right. We haven't looked at a cut by age. That's a nice idea. I think there may be effects on the older folks as well, in the sense that they don't go through promotions, like they don't move up to become a foreman or something like that. But I mean, it's something we can look into and see. So these are really quite different from the effects in the modern literature on enclaves, which are based on small refugee pockets. And so this process has led me to wonder, is there an optimal enclave size, so that it's beneficial to have a few people from the home country to help you adjust? Well, it gets to the point where it might be too many, that because you end up with density of networks coming only from your own home community and you don't meet the native born. But bringing this back to thinking about the role of geography here, what we see is that many immigrants during the age of mass migration moved to enclave neighborhoods initially. In many of these urban areas that we talked about as being non-southern and non-rural, so these are positive places with high upward mobility, immigrants tended to be living with other immigrants and in some sort of isolation in enclaves. Yet despite that, their kids were doing just as well as others living in the area who were the children of the US born. So that actually makes the degree of upward mobility for these children of immigrants look particularly good and better than I originally had thought. I thought originally, well, you're doing just as well as your neighbors, so to speak, other people in the county. But that's despite the fact that you're more likely to be living in an isolated enclave. And so that just gives an added oomph to what's going on in these immigrant households, something else to unpack. I now want to zoom out. So first I zoomed in to look at neighborhood. Now I want to zoom out to think about the role of destination country. So there is a historical element to this, but it's very tenuous. Do countries like the United States and Canada, with a history of immigrant reception, have more success in immigrant incorporation today? So to answer this question, I have been working with a large team of 39 co-authors. So papers soon to be circulated. Boustan, Jensen et al. So Matthias Jensen is a postdoc at Nuffield at Oxford.
Sounds like an enclave.
Yes, we could make our own department, actually, though we would be really quite similar to each other. So what differentiates us on this large team is that the members come from 15 destination countries today. So we're looking at the US and Canada, but we're also looking at a set of continental European countries. We're hoping to incorporate Israel and Australia as well. Those are two countries where the data is not yet in. And in order to join the project, the idea was that you'd have access to the same kind of parent-child links that we were able to use from tax records in the US. That was the Opportunity Insights graph that I showed you at the very beginning, where we had children living at home in 1980 and in the labor market in 2010. So we were successful at finding parent-child links from administrative records in 13 of our countries, and then 2 of our countries, Germany and the UK, we only have survey data. So let me show you the patterns that come out of this, and then use this to think about the question that I posed. So there's a lot going on in this graph. Each one of these points along the x-axis is a destination. The circles represent the parent generation, and the triangles represent the child generation. Everything is denominated in rank point gaps relative to the local born. So anything below 0 here, which is most of the destination countries, are places where when immigrants first arrive in the first generation, they're earning less than the local born. And then we have 2 countries here, Italy and Spain, where immigrants are earning more than the local born. This might surprise you when you're thinking about migration to Italy and Spain today. You might be thinking about Latin American migration to Spain or migration from the Middle East to Italy. But remember, we need kids who are at home in the early 1980s in order for them to grow up and have income data in the labor market now. So the composition of sending country in Italy and Spain at the time was quite different. So what we're finding here is that, first of all, in most of these destinations, the first generation, the immigrants themselves, earn less than the local born. In some cases by quite a lot, 20 rank point gap in France, for example. But also, in all of these places, there's substantial second generation convergence. When you're measuring convergence at the level of generation, the children are doing spectacularly better than the parents. And you can see that with the length of these arrows. But the third thing is, there's larger convergence for the daughters of immigrants than for the sons of immigrants. The daughters are represented with the gray lines and the sons with the red lines. And you can see that the gray lines are larger in every case, or almost every case. So we wanted to understand the sources of the remaining second generation income gap. So what we're going to be thinking about basically are the triangles here. Why is it that the triangles are not fully at parity? And there's 2 explanations. One is, in many destinations, the children of immigrants are more likely to be raised in poor households. If your parents are all the way at at a 20 rank point gap, it's actually remarkable that you're up at a 7 rank point gap or a 2 rank point gap, depending on what gender we're talking about. So there's just a substantial persistence of growing up in a poor household, despite the fact that we see convergence. So that's explanation number 1. And the second explanation is, even after controlling for parental income, we see that there's actually an immigrant advantage for being the child of immigrants in the United States and Canada. There's an immigrant advantage everywhere to being the daughter of an immigrant, almost everywhere, but sons have lower upward mobility than sons of the local born in most European destinations. So I'll sort of show you a couple of things to walk through this, because it's quite a lot. But the first is just simply lower parental income. And there's a set of destination countries, Denmark, France, Netherlands, Norway, and Sweden, where the patterns just pop out at you in this really startling way. If the children of immigrants were equally spread across the distribution, we would see 5% of the children of immigrants in each one of the income ventiles. And we would just have this flat line. But instead, in these 5 destinations, we see that over half of the children of immigrants are raised in households in the bottom 20 percentile. So it's not surprising then that we're not going to reach parity in one generation. But there's also a set of destination countries where that's not true, and in fact, children of immigrants are very equally spread across the distribution, and that includes the US and Canada. But what happens after you control for that? Let's control for parental income. Do we still see a US-Canada advantage? And so here, we're looking at what I'm calling on the slide absolute mobility. Basically, these are the intercept shifts that I started with at the beginning, when I showed you the blue and the orange lines that are both upward sloping. It's the case that growing up in high-income household does confer higher income to the child. But the question is, are the children of immigrants popped up or popped down in an intercept shift relative to the children of local born? And what you see is that in the US and Canada, both the sons and the daughters are popped up. Both of them experience that upward shift in the relationship between parent income and child income. So there's an immigrant advantage there. And I started this work on the US, so I just sort of believed in an immigrant advantage. I thought, okay, well, income is not enough because an immigrant household at the 25th percentile maybe came from a home country where they went to college, where they had a whole set of talents that maybe they can't use in the United States because they don't speak English or because they lack the networks or they don't have the right occupational certifications. So I believe strongly in this idea of immigrants conferring additional advantages. In the past, it was geography. Today, maybe it's education. But there's something that immigrant households confer to their kids beyond income. That's true in the US and Canada. And it's true for daughters of immigrants almost everywhere. So you see most of these bars are above the zero line for daughters. But for sons, not the case. Particularly in places like Austria, Netherlands, and Denmark, we see very low outcomes for sons at every point in the income distribution, sons of immigrants below sons of locals. So what do I want to say about that? Let's see. I don't think I have my phone up here. What time is it?
45 minutes.
Yeah, so I really only have like 2 more things to say. So should I just say them and then we'll do Q&A? Okay. All right, because I felt like I was sort of running into the 45-minute mark. So, okay. So why are the sons of immigrants earning less than the sons of local born raised at the same point in the income distribution? The first thought that always comes to mind for people is sending country mix. Okay? Well, in the US, we have a lot of migrants from Mexico, but we also have a lot of migrants from China. In Austria, they have a lot of migrants from Turkey, from former Yugoslavia, so maybe that's what it is. It's just sending country mix. Right off the bat, I want to argue that that's probably not what it is, for 2 reasons, and then I'll give you a little more evidence. One, we're already controlling for parental income, and so many of the relationships that we associate with sending country mix has to do with drawing from high income or low income countries. But this is now controlling for parental income. Are children doing better or worse than the local born? Second thing, there's an obvious gender pattern here where the daughters of immigrants are doing better than the daughters of local born and the sons of immigrants are doing worse. Yet daughters and sons are being drawn from the same sending country mix. So it would have to be a more complicated story about how sending country matters for the way that parents raise boys, but not for the way that they're parenting girls. Or it matters for the way that society is relating to boys, but not for the way that it relates to girls. So right off the bat, we thought it's probably not sending mix. We don't have a perfect smoking gun against sending country mix, but I want to show you at least one piece of evidence against. So the test that I'm going to show you is, let's now look at immigrants from the same sending country who are going to different destinations. So far, I've showed you all immigrants, and it could be compositional, right? But let's now take just immigrants from Turkey or just immigrants from the former Yugoslavia who go to a bunch of different destinations. If the children do equally well or equally poorly everywhere, then yes, we can say it's a sending country effect. If they are very sensitive to the destination that they're in, then we say, well, it's probably a destination country effect. Or selection, because it could be that, you know, the families with the highest potential for upward mobility are the ones that go to the US and Canada, for example. So it's not a perfect test, but at least it's our beginning point. And the challenge here is that we'd like to do this all in one big regression. However, there's not a lot of overlap in large sending countries. And this is data disclosed to us by tax authorities, so we don't have the ability to look at very small cells. We can look beyond the first two sending countries. I'm just showing you this for illustration. But you can see that there's only a couple of the cells that are shaded in, and those are the ones where there's actually overlap. So Turkey is one of our cases that we can look at. It's a high sending country for Austria, Denmark, Netherlands, and others. Former Yugoslavia we can look at. Germany we can look at. Italy we can look at, because Germany and Italy sending to a variety of places around Europe. Mexico we can't. There's just not Mexican migration to most of Europe, and until now some to Spain, but that's too late for us. So this is a reminder. We just looked at this picture for sons, right? This is like the full data, raw data. Composition could be a problem in this. And now let's look at similar patterns, country by country. Of course, these are parent country, right? So the kids are born in the destination, but we have Turkey, Yugoslavia, Morocco, Italy, and Germany. Those are the 5 we can look at. And just to compare this overall picture to Turkey, for example, I'm going to shade in the destinations that are present in, where we have enough coverage that we can look at the Turkish sons of Turkish fathers. Notice Austria, Netherlands, and Denmark are the low mobility countries overall. And we have Austria, Netherlands, and Denmark as low mobility countries for the sons of Turks. Canada is a high mobility country. Canada, again, a high mobility country. So essentially what we see in all of these pictures is that the same destination country effects that we see overall are replicated when we're looking at sending country. This is true for Italy as well, and we might think, well, some Italians were guest workers, as were Turks, but it's going to be a higher income population, it's going to be a Catholic population, so it's nice that we have Italy here, and Germany has a similar pattern, just did not fit on the slide. We have a couple of other tests, but essentially from this and from some of the earlier logic that I shared, we don't believe that what we're looking at is sending country effects. What we think we're looking at is destination country effects. There's something about the US and Canada on the one side, the high mobility side, and something about Austria and the Netherlands on the low mobility side, Denmark, that are driving these low mobility patterns for the sons of immigrants. So what could it be? We don't have perfect evidence here. Now think about this. We're dealing with basically eventually 15 data points. So far we only have 12 data points. So we're really talking like cross-country regression world. But let me show you a pretty interesting pattern that I will end with. So far we've been talking about what I call this absolute mobility gap, which is how do the children of immigrants do relative to the children of local-born raised at the same point in the distribution. So that's what we're trying to explain. That's on our y-axis. What I'm putting on the x-axis here is the absolute mobility of locals. So mechanically, that's actually part of the mobility gap, right? The mobility gap is absolute mobility of children of immigrants minus absolute mobility of locals. So there's going to be a mechanical relationship there, perhaps. However, it doesn't have to be the case. It could be that in places where the sons of locals are able to move up, sons of immigrants are also able to move up. But they're not. So here are places where sons of locals are doing incredibly well. If they're raised at the bottom of the distribution, they're reaching the median. Austria, Netherlands, Switzerland. These are places where there are institutions in place that help the sons of local born move from low income in the parent generation to median income in the kid generation. What are those institutions? Well, if you look at studies that look at upward mobility in Europe, they say vocational training programs, apprenticeships, school to work transition, and then once you get to work, manufacturing sector that has sectoral bargaining, that has unionization and high wages. So those are institutions that are helping the local born, but may not be open to the sons of immigrants. For daughters, we don't see such a relationship. Daughters of immigrants actually are doing very well in countries that have a larger service sector. They're not as dependent on manufacturing jobs. They're less likely, daughters overall are less likely to go into those kinds of apprenticeship programs. So it's not a smoking gun, but we do think that there is something going on here that's destination country specific rather than sending country specific. And might also be related to the history of immigrant incorporation when we see the US and Canada as places where the sons are doing well. But it's hard to disentangle from these other aspects of the industrial structure and the nature of the educational institutions. So I will conclude, where are the streets of gold? Well, first of all, in the United States, they were not in the South. They were not in rural areas. They were in urban areas with plentiful manufacturing jobs. The one correlate that Dylan and Michael found was associated with high mobility in the past was presence of manufacturing jobs. And those were places where immigrant families chose to locate for the parents themselves and also conferred advantages to the kids. Where are the streets of gold? They're not in immigrant enclaves. And so in the past, if you stayed in an enclave, that was not a site of high upward mobility, but immigrants quickly left for integrated neighborhoods. Some, of course, left through this very odd mobility program that we study, but most left voluntarily on their own as part of their process of assimilation, moving from a gateway neighborhood into a more integrated neighborhood. And where are the streets of gold today as immigrants moving to the US and Canada and also to new destinations? Well, they're particularly in the US still. They're particularly in Canada, and we're excited to get our Australia and Israel results as well, because that will help us understand more about these countries with a long history of immigrant incorporation. But interestingly, the daughters of immigrants seem pretty immune to these social forces that affect immigrant incorporation, and the sons are more sensitive. So for the sons of immigrants in particular, it's the parents that have moved to the New World, where the sons are doing well, and the parents who've moved to Europe, even from the same set of sending countries that are doing poorly today. Okay, thank you so much for all of your attention, and looking forward to your questions.
Okay, we've got plenty of time for questions. Omar, do you want to kick off first?
Yeah, thanks. Really fascinating stuff. My question, so you're looking at your main measure, if I understand correctly, is the upwards mobility gap. So that's comparing the mobility of the immigrants, children of immigrants, to the local population. But then you have differences across countries in just mobility within these countries. And it could be that I don't know, of course, but maybe immigrants are just very similar across countries, but it's the locals that are different. And you didn't show it. What would be nice to see is these graphs, because you're talking about upwards mobility, but in fact, you could say downwards or just mobility, because the sum is just zero, right? It's up and down, the distribution stays the same, and the slope could indicate how much mobility we have. So it'd be nice to see different countries if the slope matters for the gap.
Yeah, that's a great idea. And I think if you stare at this figure, what you're suggesting actually I think will be quite interesting. Because in the US and Canada, here the locals have if they're raised at the bottom, they're up to the 40th. But we know that the sons of immigrants are, say, like 5 points ahead. So they're at the 45th. Okay, and then in Austria, the sons of locals are at the 60th, and the immigrants might be like 10 points behind. So they're actually at the 50th. So you're right that like when you look at it this way, the children of immigrants might look much more similar across these settings. I need to think about, what would that mean? Because it means something different to reach the 40th in a place where everyone else like you is reaching the 35th than it means to reach the 40th in a place where everyone like you is reaching the 50th. So that's why we didn't do it that way. But I think it would be useful for us to just sort of stare at stare at the data in the way that you're suggesting and see if we think, how we make sense of that.
Okay, Tim and Devesh.
So today the biggest predictor of earnings is qualifications. And England is, I think, and England, not the rest of the United Kingdom, is, I think, the only country in the world where the children of immigrants are now outperforming the children of native-born people. but you didn't mention education at all today. And that leads me to a second thing. One of the reasons immigrant kids do relatively well in English schools is that some of them speak a chunk of English before they come, and failing that it's relatively easy to pick up English because English is everywhere, right? Whereas if you go to Sweden, the number of people who speak Swedish before they go to Sweden is basically zero, and therefore assimilation is much harder. And that's why I wonder whether you're saying, hey, look, they do well in the US and Canada, and the US and Canada have a long reputation, whether it's actually simply they speak English.
Okay, great set of questions. First of all, we are going to get the UK data, but it will come from a survey. It's coming from the British cohort study.
That's a good survey.
It is, and you may wonder why, since our partners are only using a survey and not admin data, why their results are not here yet. So they should be here, but they're just not here yet. Okay, second thing, college going. Given that most of our data is admin data that comes from tax authority, we only have education data for the children in 5 countries. Those are our Scandinavian and Northern European countries that have education registers. In those 5 countries, where actually the children of immigrants are not doing terribly well, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Netherlands, so the kids are not doing that well on income, yet both the boys and the girls are more likely to go to college. So that's suggesting that there's a high talent group that are actually able to do well, but then there's a large group, let's say like the bottom 80th percentile of any parental income bin, that are expecting to make a go on the basis of secondary education, vocational, and apprenticeships, and that's the group that's really falling off. In Denmark, we can really dive into all of those pieces, and it looks indeed like the college-going margins suggest that the kids of immigrants are doing better, and all those other margins suggest they're doing worse.
Okay, it's like an auction here. Devesh is next. I've got the next 4. Let's get through the next 4 after that. Okay, so Devesh.
So I like your exercise of looking at one country like Turkey, but the difference is that the cost of a Turk to move to France is much lower than moving to the United States. So is it like a different kind of people are selecting into it? And to give you another perspective, like different from the point raised before, if you look at the UK government statistics, for past 40 years, people from minority groups, primarily coming from Bangladesh and Pakistan, they are amongst the lowest percentile of income and education. So there the mobility has not happened, even though they come from with some exposure to English so it would be nice in that sense to, for example, compare Indians in the UK to Indians in the US, because the distance is relatively large for these countries, and they both have exposure to English in home, something like that.
I was really disappointed that we didn't have India and we didn't have China as countries that we could compare. I think that's because these are folks who had to have arrived by 1984. I also think it's because we don't have the UK data yet, so maybe once we do, we'll be. The one group that we are trying to bring into that analysis is the Vietnamese. There we do have at least 4 or 5 destinations that we can look at. Now, on distance traveled and such, we have one other analysis that I didn't bring just for interest of time, which is maybe we don't have to worry about all the countries matching. If we do this, we're only going to have 5, 6 countries at most. Maybe instead we just take all the sending countries that are there, regardless of whether they match with another destination, and we just rank them from highest mobility to lowest mobility. And then we look at not just the averages here, but we can look at the interquartile range. What is the experience of the 25th percentile sending country and the 75th percentile country? Are they really close and dense around the median, or are they really dispersed? So perhaps, and I don't know the English case well enough, maybe Bangladesh is a country where the kids are doing really badly. Maybe there's another sending country like China where the kids are doing really well. Okay, so then we would see a lot of dispersion. And indeed, when we do that, we see something that looks very tight around the median. So it looks like essentially all of the sending countries to Austria, whether they match with another destination or not, are doing poorly. All of the sending countries to Canada are doing well. And they're not all from far away. It's not only the Turks and it's not only the Moroccans who are going to Canada, but we also have, Jamaicans, we also have, it's a set of Caribbean and Latin American countries. So I like that exercise. It doesn't allow us to directly eyeball, but I think it sort of tells a similar story.
Okay, so I had Kevin, Aparov, Sasha, Alex, then Steve. No, Vishnu, then Steve. Okay, and that'll take us through. So
My questions have been asked. So
your question, Aparov.
Yeah. So within ethnic enclaves, does it matter how much fractionalization there is about immigrants or the upward mobility? And is it the case that ethnic enclaves are more diverse today than they were in the past?
That's a really cool question. I don't know the answer to that at all. So we were only looking at kind of own country. Like how many of the people who are living around you are from the own country, but not at the composition of, is it just two groups and they're highly polarized, or is it very fractionalized and with lots of groups? I think that's really cool, and I don't know the answer, but it's a great idea.
Okay, it's Sasha next, then Alex.
I have two questions, if I may. One is the selection into which country, which I think is a question that hasn't been studied much, right? So why, for instance, the Ukrainian refugee ends up in Luxembourg and another one in Australia? What drives that? And the second one is the mix of economic migrants versus refugees. How does that factor in to what you said?
I really don't have great answers to either of the questions. Okay, for refugees, in the late 70s, early 80s, the main groups are Vietnamese, which we are going to be able to add, Iranian, and Sri Lankan. In the US also El Salvador, but only in the US. So the types of refugees that we're thinking about from today, who are coming from the Middle East, were not the relevant refugee countries at the time. So hopefully we can look at the Vietnamese, but that's going to be the only specific refugee country that we'll be able to focus on. It would be nice if we had visa status in the data, but we don't, so that we could separate out maybe some smaller refugee groups.
Okay, Alex next.
On selection, by the way, I don't have much to say either. I mean, I just do want to point out, just to be transparent, that the one high mobility country we have on all these pictures is Canada, and Canada does have a point system. And so to access Canada, you had to go through a set of check marks to say, I do speak English, or I can prove it on a test, I do have a higher degree. Each one of those things gives you an added point. And family reunification also does, so there are people who are coming in without the high points on the education side, but that could explain, the upward mobility of Turks and residents of the former Yugoslavia to Canada, for example. It could be a very different composition than selection than the rest of Europe. In that case, just maybe drop Canada from the graphs and focus on the rest. I think the selection into the set of other European destinations is pretty similar, and it's just a matter of where you get a work contract, where you get refugee status, that sort of thing.
Okay, Alex.
I mean, you have received a lot of very profound questions, and also related. So allow me one petty little linguistic comment. Just for the sake of historical accuracy, which takes nothing away from the substance of the analysis. So you showed us lovely graphs, some maps at the beginning, and you say, well, they didn't go to the south, they went to, and you referred to the New England and the Rust Belt. It was at the beginning of the 20th century. There's nothing rusty in the decline. And coming from me, I have to raise this group of human geographers, historians, and what they call history reflectors manufacturing. I think the picture belt captures it a bit better because it really stresses the point that they went to the region which was the most successful part of the universe at that time. And when you look at the map, and if you stay here for tomorrow, you will see what is there is exactly the outline of the manufacturing belt between 1880 and
absolutely. And so perhaps it was like Nick Kraft style humor, maybe. I don't know. I was to me, I thought it was kind of funny that we would think today it's the Rust Belt, but in the past, of course, like these are absolutely the best places to arrive as an immigrant, and it was like a high manufacturing zone.
I meant to that I rise to the debate, and we probably succeeded.
Yeah, sorry. I mean, it's just a little. To me, it was just kind of like a silly, funny comment.
As I said, it's a petty little comment.
I agree. Okay. I mean, well, I don't agree it's petty, but I take the point for it, and very much.
Okay, Bishnu, then Steve.
Yeah, so I'm going back to your historical data. So the enclave versus non-enclave. Is it coming through schooling? I mean, is there an advantage to go to a school which is not just your own community? And would that matter for today as well? Like, how segregated are schools and neighborhoods into that? I guess at the country level, it's impossible to do that.
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, for the second generation in the Catholic Church's study, we find that education is a very important channel. So these ethnic churches were often bundled with a parochial school. Particularly in the Polish case, the school would be half the day in Polish or half the day speaking about Polish history and Polish literature. And so even the length of the school day and length of the school year, you might want to cut in half when you're thinking about the relevant human capital that the children will be building. But of course, the measures we have in the census are just how many years did you go to school, and it's not adjusted for what you're actually doing in the curriculum. So when we're looking at those census measures, we see that the children who are raised in an enclave that forms after a new Polish church is built are less likely to go on beyond 8th grade. They have lower years of schooling overall, and they're more likely to hold manual occupations, perhaps as a result. So I do think that that particular institution was holding kids back. That doesn't mean to say that it's always the case that going to school with other kids from the same home community would have that effect, but this particular church school and the nature of the education there did have that effect.
Okay, so that's Steve and then Ken.
I was just wondering about the difference between sons and daughters. Did you have a look at, I don't know what information you have, but did you look at marriage behaviour and labour supply and things like that?
So far, not at all, but that is our next project. So I didn't mention, just for interest of time, that our outcome variable there was individual income. It was not household income. So it's the income that the daughters themselves are reporting as earned, the income that the sons themselves are reporting as earned, regardless of whether you're married or not, and whether you may have a partner who's also bringing income into the household. Now that we've found these really interesting gender patterns, our next step is to go back to all of our teams, get household income, get marriage status, yes or no, children in the household, yes or no, age of the children, and look at also the participation margin as well, because we're thinking that the patterns could be accentuated or could be reversed when we look at household income. But that's a great idea.
Okay, Kevin?
Yeah, on ethnic educational efforts, I suppose we know now that more people return to Europe than we once thought, and there might be an argument for learning Polish in that context. But what I was actually thinking was that in Dublin, there's ethnic Poles and Lithuanians who came in the noughties. They would have their own classes and they would learn Polish and Lithuanian. They would also learn maths because they were appalled by the low standard maths among the locals. So that goes to show that you can't, like as you were saying at the beginning, you can't generalize across time and space.
Right. Yeah. Well, and these days, at least in the U.S., many of my colleagues, whether they're Russian-born or not, send their kids to Russian math. Russian math school is like an activity for kids on the weekends.
Not your kids.
Not my kids, but.
Small things. One connects to the point that Tim made about language. It's very interesting perhaps to compare, for example, US and kind of English-speaking countries with, for example, France, an immigration from African countries where French people know French, and to check what Roman's language today. The other question is a bit about, I appreciate the whole things about different mobility, and I wonder if there are any studies in a way validate whether upward mobility also means increased happiness in example of welfare, we got from one person. It's going to be the case that if one lives in an enclave minority, that one says, okay, I take for granted that I progress less.
Yeah.
I'm so happy, I get so much utility from being here that compensates.
I think that's very important. Okay. So on language, just briefly, language, distance, those are things that we can try to look at in more detail. So I appreciate those points that have come up. On welfare and well-being for those who choose to live in an enclave, we think we're seeing glimmers of the fact that people are making this choice very well aware of the trade-off. So when we look at the children who are raised in enclaves, for example, we see that they're less likely to leave their state of birth, less likely to leave the city in which they were raised. So that's a sign that they are embedded in the community and from a revealed preference point of view, want to stay there. Why might that be? And we can see all of these cultural outcomes that people do value. More likely to marry someone within the home community, give your kids names that are associated with the home country, and so on. In the case of the IRO program, we see that half of the IRO participants returned to New York. They were, going off on their way to try to make it somewhere else in the U.S. When they got there, presumably they found, well, there's not a lot of Jews here. There's not Yiddish theater, etc. I'm going back to New York. And who went back to New York? It was people who at baseline had a more Jewish first name, which might be a sign that their family was more connected to the Jewish community. So yes, I'm giving up on 4% higher income, but what is 4% higher income when compared to these community attributes? And so different people make different choices there.
Okay, Marcus.
The last three about prices and economics went to immigrants to the United States. I wonder if you have any comments there. Perhaps the importance of going to the right enclave.
Well, I don't think Claudia Golden is an immigrant, but she is perhaps the child of immigrants. I'm trying to remember about her parents. But she did grow up in the Bronx, very close to a couple of other members of the Harvard Economics Department who also grew up in the Bronx. So it seems like somehow that was an enclave that produced a lot of human capital.
Okay, another question? Or I can ask my question. Okay, so, and someone's just rubbing here. Okay, you've got this great example, programmatic, it's an immense research program. So what next? What are the unanswered questions, right? One would be a lead structure, immigrants and lead structure, but what? Because it seems like you've done this like a detective, particularly with this question of the enclaves and working out what's going on in different countries. So you must have an idea of directions for historical immigration research. What do you think?
Wow. So you're going to stop me on this one. I think that I've gotten really sucked into this multi-country project, and so the next thing I was going to do is what Steve suggested, which is look at household income, marital status, fertility, participation decision for women, and understand the gender component a little bit more. I've become somewhat obsessed with this idea of optimal enclave size, so I'm having a hard time thinking through how you would actually be able to operationalize that. So I've given you little hints of where my work is going next, but it's really not, there's no grand story of something that I haven't showed you yet. It's just, I think, just continuing to push on this. I have to say, when I wrote Streets of Gold and it came out 2 years ago, I thought, I'm not going to work on immigration anymore. I'm going to do something completely different, and I'm going to take a third project, right? And there's just been so much additional work so many questions that have come up from various audiences that leave me wanting to keep pushing on this. In fact, the first time that I presented Streets of Gold to an audience, it was in DC, to policymakers, and they said, I love the rainbow on the front cover of your book, but is this optimistic story true in Europe as well? And it was that got my mind sort of my wheels were turning, and then I met Alan Manning and Matthias Jensen, who were working on a similar topic in Denmark, and so we were the ones that joined forces and tried to bring all these folks together. If it hadn't been for like going out into the community and talking to people, you guys are people too, but you're also academics, talking to people who don't think about the research questions but are thinking about the real world, I don't think it would have ever occurred to me. I would have kind of stayed in my lane and say, oh, I'm a U.S. economic historian, what do I have to say about integration in Europe? But the topic just seems too pressing.
That makes sense. And then, okay, the other thing that strikes me is, okay, thinking about recent patterns of U.S. immigration, right? Let's say over the past 20 years and all the issues related to that, how different is it to previous epochs of U.S. immigration across whatever dimensions you can think of, right?
Well, to the immigrants that arrived up through the early 80s, that we can look at the kids and then follow the parents, it was strikingly similar set of patterns that we were finding, whether we were looking at upward mobility for kids, whether we were looking at cultural assimilation, which we've done in looking at the naming patterns that moms have for their children. Kind of you name it, we were finding similarity rather than difference. But we can't push all the way forward to the modern period, because particularly if we're going to be looking at children's outcomes, we need time for the kids to grow up. And there's one thing that's very special about the cohort that I've talked about with you, which is that some of their parents arrived undocumented, but then they went through the amnesty program, the 1986 amnesty under President Reagan. So if they had limitation in their family because of documentation status, those limitations were lifted. We don't know whether the patterns that we're showing you today and the other things we talked about in the book are true for immigrants who are coming now, and many of whom are undocumented. And we especially don't know what's going on with asylum seekers today, which is really a brand new topic in the US. It's like we're always fighting the last war. First it was like, let's fence the border, let's put drones on the border, make it very hard for people to come in just by walking across. And now the asylum system, which has always been there, but wasn't used to the volume that it's used today, is suddenly a really big policy concern. So that is brand new, and we don't know whether these results would hold for that group.
Okay, I'll give Sasha one last question, because it's like otherwise we'll swear you out. Right?
Yeah, the son and daughter stuff I find super fascinating, and I'm wondering how much of it is also then marital patterns. That to the extent that often women marry slightly older men, there is a different selection pattern for daughters into men where you can already see the economic status, whereas for men it's vice versa.
Yeah, so we're going to be looking at marriage and household income next, but we do have one little glimmer of evidence on this. It's very minor, but we were able to look at labor force participation, essentially. Like, do you have zero earnings or do you have positive earnings? And remember, the daughters of immigrants are earning more than the daughters of local born raised at the same point in the distribution in many of these countries. Guess what? That is despite the fact that they are less likely to participate. So their income includes the zeros here. Okay, so if you're not participating, we're giving you a zero income. Despite that, the daughters of immigrants are earning a bit more. So they're conditional on working, they're earning more. But they're also less likely to work. So we're thinking that has something to do with marital status, perhaps. Are you married, yes or no? And then if you're married, are you likely to pull off the labor market, yes or no? Those are things we need to pursue further. But it suggests that for those who are working, they're doing remarkably well. And we need to really start to dig into what's going on there. In US data, we did some exploration over the summer to understand, is it college major and occupation? And it seems like the daughters of immigrants are indeed more likely to take college majors that are lucrative. They're more likely to be in medicine and pharmacy and engineering and those sorts of things. So that might be what's going on, and that could be a very high return activity that then compensates for the non-participation at the bottom. But all things that I'm really excited to get into that are pulling me a little bit away from some of the historical work, but just going where the questions lead.
Okay, I think we'll leave it there. And so let's thank Leah for like a great lecture, an incredible research program, and an immense ability to think and respond.